In mid-February 2021, Texas was hit by an Arctic cold snap, unusual for a region unaccustomed to such extremes. Temperatures plunged, ice-coated power lines, and the state's electricity demand surged as homes turned on heaters. By February 15, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, began instituting rolling blackouts, cutting power to millions in an attempt to avoid total system collapse. At the peak, over 4.5 million customers, households and businesses, lost electricity, some for days. Many regions had no heat, no light, and limited water, as water systems and pumping stations were themselves disabled by power outages. People across the state found themselves unprepared for sub-zero weather, children and elderly in unheated homes, pipes freezing and bursting, families huddled in blankets, and many forced to make impossible decisions, stay in place or risk danger venturing outside. Some used stoves or generators indoors, leading to carbon monoxide poisoning risks. The emotional shock spread quickly. For a state long proud of energy independence and resilience, this was a collapse of faith. The lights out became not just a metaphor, but a lived reality, the moment when modern infrastructure stopped and vulnerability began. Texas's power grid is largely isolated from the rest of the U.S. This design was intentional. By staying independent, Texas avoids federal regulation of its electricity market. But that very independence became a trap in 2021. ERCOT, Electric Reliability Council of Texas, manages about 90% of the state's generation and transmission systems. It is deregulated, with many private generators and power retailers competing in a free market. The trade-off for that freedom: little federal oversight, minimal reserve margins, and weak requirements for weatherization. For years, experts warned Texas that its grid was vulnerable to extreme weather. After a 2011 winter blackout, federal agencies and grid reliability bodies recommended winterizing power plants, pipelines, and fuel supply systems. But Texas officials largely ignored or deferred those calls. Thus, when the cold came, many generation sources failed, gas wells froze, wind turbines iced, and power plants couldn't ramp up. Transmission constraints and lack of backup imports exacerbated the gap between supply and demand. In short, the structure that gave Texas control and flexibility also disabled its ability to borrow power, share load, or compensate when its own system failed. That isolation, once a source of pride, became a strategic weakness. The failure in Texas was not triggered by a single event, but by the convergence of extreme weather and system fragility. Between February 11 to 20, 2021, a deep freeze, unprecedented in scale, engulfed the state. For many days, temperatures remained well below freezing, damaging infrastructure across sectors. During the heart of the crisis, around February 14 to 18, ERCOT experienced sustained generation shortfalls. On average, over 34,000 megawatts of generation were offline in consecutive days, nearly half of Texas's winter peak. In a historic move, ERCOT ordered manual rolling blackouts totaling up to 20,000 megawatts of load shed to avoid grid collapse. Every form of generation was impacted: thermal, gas, coal, nuclear, units derated or failed, wind turbines froze, and natural gas production, transport, and supply systems themselves became impaired. Critically, transmission lines and fuel infrastructure were not sufficiently insulated or hardened for extreme cold. Some gas pipelines froze or lost pressure. Some gas plants could not access fuel due to upstream disruptions. It was not just stress on generation, it was a cascading systemic failure. As units dropped off, the remaining capacity was stretched, further destabilizing the grid until drastic measures were required. By some accounts, ERCOT was only 4 minutes and 37 seconds away from a complete statewide blackout before controlled shutdowns began. This was the perfect storm. Weather beyond the norm meeting infrastructure built for average conditions, triggered cascading failures across generation, fuel, and transmission simultaneously. Behind every megawatt failure lies human suffering. The 2021 Texas blackout was no exception. Its toll was counted not only in power metrics, but in lives disrupted, systems strained, and lives lost. Official accounting in Texas placed the death toll at 246 people whose deaths were directly or indirectly tied to the disaster. But independent investigations and excess mortality studies suggest the actual number may have been much higher. Some estimates range into the hundreds more. Many deaths resulted from hypothermia in unheated homes, carbon monoxide poisoning from indoor generators or improper combustion, and failure of medical equipment. One 11-year-old boy died in an unheated mobile home and became the focal point of lawsuits. Beyond fatalities, millions suffered from water shortages. Nearly half of Texans experienced disrupted water service due to frozen or offline water treatment and pumping systems. Food supply chains broke down. Grocery stores ran out of essentials. For many, refrigerated food spoiled. For others, heating fuel, backup supplies, or even clean drinking water became luxuries. In rural and lower-income areas, the impact was sharper. Some counties with higher proportions of Hispanic or vulnerable populations saw longer outages or slower recovery. Critical infrastructure, hospitals, nursing homes, medical equipment, was strained or shut down. The human cost is often invisible in charts and megawatts, but for Texan families it was all too real: grief, trauma, lost property, and a newfound vulnerability in a society that assumed constant power. Once the immediate crisis passed, the hardest questions began. Who allowed this to happen? How did warnings go unheeded? The Texas blackout exposed not just technical failure, but failure of leadership, regulation, and accountability. In the years preceding 2021, multiple warnings sounded. Federal and regional reliability bodies flagged that the Texas grid's vulnerability to cold had been underestimated and recommended winterization of plants and fuel infrastructure. But in Texas, political and regulatory inertia slowed or blocked comprehensive reforms. During the crisis, strategic decisions made by grid operators compounded damage. In some cases, ERCOT ordered or allowed power companies to shut down parts of the natural gas supply chain to preserve grid integrity, which in turn made fuel inaccessible to power plants trying to operate. Some transmission operators cut power to gas infrastructure indirectly. Market incentives also distorted responses. When electricity prices spiked to $9,000 per megawatt-hour, from the normal $1.50 range, some companies made large profits by selling power during scarcity, while others collapsed under mounting costs they couldn't recover. Private power retailers and generation firms were exposed to huge financial risk. The crisis uncovered mismatches in contracts, hedging, and regulatory oversight. In the aftermath, the CEO of ERCOT was dismissed, and political pressure mounted for reform. The state legislature passed Senate Bill 3, mandating gas supply chain winterization oversight and inspection of critical gas infrastructure. However, enforcement remains uneven and critics argue many structural weaknesses remain. In short, beyond freezing temperatures, the collapse was a failure of governance, command, accountability, and alignment of incentives to protect public welfare. The technical flaws were multiplied by political and corporate choices. Power is fundamental. When electricity fails, most modern systems unravel. In Texas, blackout triggered a cascade of failures across water, food, transport, and the very economy. One of the earliest knock-on effects was water. Water treatment plants, pumps, and pipelines depend on electricity. As power failed, some water systems shut down or delivered unsafe water. Nearly 49% of Texans experienced water service disruption. Some had to boil water before use, others had no water at all. Grocery supply chains buckled. Without power, refrigeration failed and stored food spoiled. Transportation froze. Gasoline pumps, traffic lights, loading docks, all depended on electricity or fuel. Supermarkets ran bare within hours. Many Texans struggled to get basic food, let alone access to cooking or heating supplies. Financial systems also suffered. ATMs and banks halted operations. Online payment systems struggled. The spike in electricity cost premiums forced many to decide which bills to pay first or leave homes unheated. The disruption revealed how tightly all systems are interlinked, and how dependent we are on constant power flow. Some rural and vulnerable regions experienced worse delays in recovery, because grid repairs, water restoration, and supply chains favored urban or wealthier areas first. Thus, what began as a frozen grid became a spiral. Without electricity, water failed, food failed, transport failed, and society's trust in infrastructure cracked. The blackout was the first domino. Every system that followed hinged on continuing power. In the months and years after the disaster, Texas experts, regulators, and politicians pledged reforms. Yet many of the same vulnerabilities remain, for reasons political inertia, cost, and delayed enforcement. One key lesson: winterize everything. Power plants, natural gas infrastructure, pipelines, and fuel storage systems must be insulated, heated, and surge-ready for extreme cold. Federal and state reports strongly recommended these changes. Many natural gas pipeline failures were a root cause of power plant fuel unavailability. Another lesson: reserve margins and redundancy matter. The grid lacks sufficient surplus capacity. During the event, more than half of generation was offline. Load shedding of up to 20,000 megawatts was necessary to avoid catastrophic collapse. However, enforcement has lagged. Some power plants and gas operators remain behind schedule on weatherization inspections. Some systemic market incentives remain misaligned. Trading prices, cost recovery mechanisms, and regulatory oversight all still contain loopholes. Critics note that while legislation, e.g. Senate Bill 3, exists, the gas industry's regulatory body, Texas Railroad Commission, was slower to adopt strict winterization mandates compared to electric regulators. Also, linking the grid to neighboring states, thus allowing imports, remains politically and technically difficult, even though it could offer failover capacity. In 2024, some analysts warned that if another storm like Uri hit, rolling blackouts are still likely. The grid is not fully fixed. The danger: complacency. After crises, memory fades and budgets shrink. The biggest threat now is not another storm. It's forgetting lessons we already paid for. If Texas could come so close to catastrophe in 2021, what's to stop a repeat, either there or elsewhere? The 2021 event was more warning than exception. As weather extremes intensify, more regions may find themselves on the edge. Many grids globally lack the resilience or flexibility Texas lacked. And some nations have less margin for error. The 2021 blackout serves as a case study. When systems are built for average conditions, extremes break the seams. Texas's go it alone isolation meant it could not import power to cover deficits. Most other U.S. grids are interconnected, yet that interconnectivity is a double-edged sword. A regional failure can cascade. The lesson: flexibility, interconnection, and redundancy are critical. Climate change suggests more frequent and severe, unprecedented weather. Cold snaps, heat waves, storms, they strain infrastructure far beyond design margins. The next blackout may not be cold-driven. It could come from heat, drought, cyber attack, or system overload. Human complacency is a structural risk. We assume electricity is eternal. We budget for growth, not fragility. But one blackout is enough to reset that assumption. The real danger is when we forget that we live on the edge. In a world built on electricity, it takes only one night of darkness to remember how fragile we truly are. If we heed the warning, in our policies, infrastructure, and vigilance, we may survive the next outbreak. But if we ignore it, we may discover too late how little we control.